Not all stories rise to the surface. Some stay buried beneath layers of dust, sealed scrolls, and the silence of time. We remember the kings, the generals, the grand betrayals. But what of the cook who made history boil? This is not a tale you'll find in school books. It's not a ghost story told by firelight, nor a legend sung in some echoing hall. This one simmers, quietly, menacingly, in the steam and steel of an imperial kitchen. Richard Roose was no warrior, no bishop, no rebel with a cause. He was a man behind the stove, a cook for the clergy, an ordinary soul with calloused hands and a wooden spoon. But in 1531, he was dragged from his ladle and cast into one of the darkest corners of English justice. He was boiled alive, not in metaphor, not in myth, in truth. Flesh blistered, lungs choked on rising steam. Bubbles, blood, and screams, his final ingredients. This wasn't punishment, it was spectacle. A horror so rare, it was reserved for monsters and for messages. And Roose, he was the first. The example, the warning. But why? What sin could drag a cook to such an end? What poison could trigger royal wrath so fierce that it redefined treason itself? This is not just the story of an execution. It is the tale of a turning point, when fear boiled over and justice, if it can be called that, was cooked alive. Before we stir the past, we have just one request. If you value these stories buried in shadows, consider subscribing. Your click fuels our fire and helps us keep memory alive. So now, let's lift the lid, smell the truth, taste the terror, and remember the forgotten boiling of Richard Roose, a tale steeped in blood and swallowed by silence. Great tragedies don't begin with the act. They begin with the air, the mood, the pressure, the storm before the strike. To understand why Richard Roose was boiled alive, we must step into England in 1531. Not a realm of glory and gold, but one trembling beneath its own weight. Henry VIII sat on the throne, but his crown was heavy with doubt. His court whispered like a nest of snakes. Ambition, envy, and betrayal slithered through every corridor. The Reformation was rumbling across Europe. Martin Luther's words had shattered centuries of silence. And though Henry still wore the title Defender of the Faith, his gaze wandered. His alliances wavered. The Pope's hold was slipping, and with it came fear of change, of collapse, of chaos. But the threat wasn't just from pulpits and pamphlets. It came from within, from counselors with veiled motives, from queens without sons, from poisoned platters carried by smiling servants. The Tudor dynasty was young, fragile, and Henry ruled with suspicion as his sword. Every shadow looked like treason. And then there was the kitchen. A place of nourishment, yes. But in a time like this, it was also a battlefield, because poison was the silent weapon. No blade, no scream, just a slow death with every bite. So when 2 people died after a meal, when others fell ill, trembling and sick, and when the cook, Richard Roose, was accused of tampering with the pot, that was all it took. No trial of fairness, no weighing of motives, just fear, power, and fury. And when kings are afraid they do not uphold justice, they redefine it. Henry didn't just order an execution, he forged a new punishment, something unforgettable, something terrifying. A man was accused, a message was needed, and the pot, already simmering with suspicion, was brought to a violent boil. Prominent tales told throughout history. They often swirl around kings, conquerors, and crowned conspiracies, but not this one. This story bubbles from the bottom, from the hands of a cook, a kitchen, and a single pot. A man who stirred soups, until the day he stirred fear. Richard Roose wasn't born to shape history. He held no titles. He led no armies. He simply served within the household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. But in March of 1531, a stew became a scandal. 2 members of the bishop's household collapsed and died after eating a meal. Others followed, writhing in pain, their bodies betraying them. And in the middle of it all, a single pot, a strange white powder, and the name Richard Roose. He was seized, interrogated, and under pressure, confessed. But then the story shifted. Roose claimed it was a joke. A prank, he said, a cruel one, but harmless in intention. He meant only to cause sickness, not death. A laugh. But there was no laughter in Henry's England, not with poison on the tongue. To the Tudor mind, poison wasn't just a weapon, it was treason in liquid form. It was foreign, feminine, cowardly, unfit for men but perfect for betrayal. And this wasn't just any household, it belonged to the church. Suddenly, the act wasn't petty mischief. It was sacrilege, it was sedition. Yet, no motive ever surfaced. Roose had no vendetta, no history of hatred, no cause, just a cook, a kitchen, and a calamity. Was he a killer cloaked in humble garb? Or a fool who stirred the wrong pot? We may never know. Because in a kingdom ruled by fear, even a spoonful of suspicion can sink a man. And once the pot boiled over, the lid was never meant to close again. History doesn't always begin with malice. Sometimes it starts with a laugh, or so Richard Roose claimed. Not all killers intend to kill, and not every crime is born from hatred. According to Roose, it was never meant to end in death. A prank. That's what he said. A moment of mischief, ill-timed, ill-judged, and ultimately fatal. The white powder he sprinkled into the Bishop of Rochester's stew wasn't meant to take lives. Just ruin a few meals, trigger some retching, elicit groans and gags, perhaps even a cruel chuckle from the kitchen. But what followed was no comedy. 2 dead, several convulsing in agony, a household in panic, and a kingdom listening. Roose was seized at once, dragged from the kitchen shadows into the blinding fire of royal scrutiny. He confessed, but not clearly, not cleanly. Fear shaped his words, and later regret reshaped them. He insisted it was all in jest, no rage, no motive, just stupidity. But in 1531, England had no patience for stupidity. This was an age where kings feared silence more than screams, where the clink of a spoon could trigger suspicion. And poison was the perfect traitor, invisible, silent, and final. Roose's timing couldn't have been worse. Henry VIII didn't just want order, he wanted obedience. And nothing said, "Do not cross me," like inventing a new punishment. There were no public hearings, no appeals, no stages for pity. His defense, "I meant no harm," wasn't even a whisper against the roar of royal fear. Because for Henry, intent was irrelevant. Impact was everything. It didn't matter whether Roose was a murderer or a fool. People had died. The church had been touched. The king had been alarmed. So the joke became a crime, the prank became policy, and the bubbling pot turned into a boiling symbol of power. Richard Roose laughed once. But history? It answered with silence and steam. Sometimes history doesn't evolve, it erupts. One moment, one spark, and everything changes. In this tale, the spark was poison, but the fire came roaring from the throne. When Henry VIII heard the news, that 2 lay dead after dining in a bishop's house, that a common cook had confessed to slipping powder into their stew, he didn't wait. He didn't ponder motive. He didn't call for calm. He acted immediately, absolutely, furiously, because to Henry this was no ordinary crime. It was treason brewed in broth, a dagger delivered through dinner. If a cook could kill, if a servant could strike from the kitchen, then trust itself was dead. And without trust, the kingdom would rot from the inside out. So the king did what only kings can do. He rewrote the rules. In a single night, a new statute was born. Not debated, not refined, just declared. Poisoning, it now said, would be high treason. No exceptions, no defense. And the punishment? Boiling, alive. Not metaphor, not symbol, but flesh, heat, and agony. There would be no jury of peers, no royal clemency, no swift sword, only a cauldron, and screams rising like steam. This wasn't law made by reason. It was law made by fear, law made by rage. It wasn't about Richard Roose anymore. It was about control. It was about power. Henry's decree didn't just punish one man. It warned a nation. Fear your food, fear your servants, and above all, fear your king. It was monarchy in its rawest form. Not justice, not balance, just vengeance poured into policy. One cook, one kitchen, one moment, and England would never taste safety the same way again. Most executions end with a snap, a swing, or a spark. But this one ended in a simmer. April 5th, 1531. Smithfield Market, London. Once a place for cattle and trade, now transformed into a theater of agony. A man was to die, Richard Roose. A cook turned cautionary tale, but not by rope, not by sword, not even by fire. This death would come by water, boiling, alive. A massive iron cauldron stood in the square, not filled with stew or stock, but with scalding, hissing punishment. The flames beneath it leapt and twisted, as if excited for the role they were about to play. Crowds gathered early. Merchants, laborers, nobles, drawn not by justice, but by the promise of horror. Roose arrived in chains, shaking, silent. There is no record of his final words, only what followed. They lowered him into the water, alive, and Smithfield listened to the steam, to the crackling skin, to the screams, sharp, human, unforgettable. Some say he was lifted in and out, as if cruelty was a performance. Others claim he was simply left to boil, his lungs filling with vapor, his flesh bursting into blisters. It wasn't just execution, it was ritual, a carefully choreographed act of state terror. The message seared into every spectator: poison is treason, treason will cook. No trial, no mercy, just heat, and a king's vengeance made visible. This was the first legal boiling alive in English history, and nearly the last. Even for a brutal age, it crossed a line. People were horrified, not just by the death, but by the intent behind it. Because this wasn't about justice, it was about obedience. It was about the kitchen becoming a battlefield, the pot a weapon, and fear the final seasoning. Richard Roose had stirred the wrong stew, and now in front of hundreds, he was served as an example. A man melted into monarchy's recipe for control. Most punishments fade into history, but some sounds remain long after the flames die, long after the crowds disperse. Screams, true screams, born of boiling flesh, don't disappear. They echo, they haunt. On that April morning in 1531, Smithfield Market didn't host a trial. It hosted a spectacle. Richard Roose, the cook, not a general, not a traitor in armor, just a man with a spoon, now condemned to die in a pot. Witnesses say the moment his skin touched the water, he began to scream. Not words, not pleas, just pain. Pure, primal, and unbearable. The kind of scream that scrapes against bone, the kind that silences 1,000 onlookers. Steam rose like spirits escaping the body. His flesh blistered, bubbled, peeled. The pot hissed with every movement, as tendons tore and muscles shrank away from bone. Some accounts say he was lifted, drenched in agony, then lowered again, over and over, until breath was a memory. Others say he sank beneath the surface, and the screaming stopped too soon. But in every version, one thing remains: the sound, the hissing, the bubbling, the shrieking. No ballad was sung that day, no cheers, no applause, just silent horror painted on every face. Because even in an age of rack and fire, this felt different. This wasn't justice, it was domination. Theatrical, merciless domination. What Roose heard as he boiled, the roar of the crowd, the cracking of skin, the final collapse of his voice, wasn't just death. It was power made audible. The message was clear. This is what happens when fear rules the kitchen. Henry VIII wanted obedience. He wanted silence. But what he created were screams that never stopped echoing. No one forgot that day. Not the crowd, not the cooks, not the kingdom. Because after Smithfield, they all knew the kitchen was no longer safe. And laughter could boil you alive. Not all executions are carried out for justice. Some are staged, directed, choreographed, scene by scene, scream by scream. Richard Roose's death wasn't just a punishment. It was a production, a play penned in panic and lit by flame. This was terror made theatrical, not in shadowy prisons, not whispered in corridors of power, but unveiled at Smithfield. The butcher's square turned into a burning pulpit. Here, meat was once traded. Now, a man's body was offered as a lesson. Henry VIII didn't boil Roose to protect the innocent. He boiled him to instruct them, to say, this is what happens when loyalty falters, when treason simmers in the kitchen, when even the help can kill. The audience came in waves. Craftsmen, clergy, mothers with children in tow. They weren't simply watching, they were being indoctrinated. With every hiss from the pot, every rising wail, they were absorbing the true message. This was a sermon of suffering, and Henry was the preacher. Every scream was deliberate, every bubble rehearsed. This wasn't law, it was theater. A kingdom's fear, performed in full daylight. Because when power is fragile, it becomes theatrical, and fear becomes its script. In that boiling square, the people were not passive, they were the target, and they were the tool. The crowd was taught to obey, not from respect but from dread, and they learned. Because fear doesn't end when the fire goes out. It lingers, it soaks into your clothes, it walks home beside you, it mutters while you sleep. Years later, they still spoke of Roose, not as a man, but as a memory, as a threat given shape and steam. Don't betray the crown, don't poison the pot, or you'll meet the boil. What may have begun as a reckless joke became a national ritual, a one-act tragedy, written by tyranny, fueled by paranoia, and burned into the bones of every soul who watched. Because in Henry's England, terror didn't hide. It took the stage, and everyone was expected to applaud. History has a way of clouding the truth. What we remember, what we need to believe, are not always the same. And with Richard Roose, what rose from the cauldron wasn't just steam, it was doubt. He confessed to adding a powder, but then recanted, said it was a joke, a prank poorly timed, no malice, no intent, just sickness, not death. There was no evidence of motive, no plots, no cause, just two dead, and a cook who stirred the pot. But timing is everything, and 1531 was no ordinary year. England trembled beneath the weight of change. Heresy whispered through pulpits. The church strained. The king's throne, steady on the outside, wobbled beneath distrust. In such an atmosphere, truth loses its footing. Fear fills the gaps, and someone must pay. Roose was low-born, voiceless, disposable. There was no trial, no jury, no defense. Only a rushed confession, and a new law, crafted after the fact, designed not to clarify justice, but to amplify punishment. Roose may have been guilty, or reckless, or tragically foolish, but we'll never truly know. Because once the pot boiled, it didn't just cook a man. It erased the details. All that remained was smoke, screams, and spectacle. His punishment wasn't about balance, it was about theater, about fear, about silencing dissent before it could speak. So what does that tell us about the crown, the court, a kingdom so quick to burn a man and so slow to ask why? Perhaps Roose was more than a cook. Perhaps he was a symbol, a scapegoat, a casualty of control. Because sometimes, when fear stirs the pot, truth doesn't rise with the steam, it drowns in it. Some laws are born from debate, others are born from fear, and in 1531, fear boiled over. Richard Roose didn't just make headlines, he made history, not through his crime, but through the punishment it inspired. When word of the poisoned meal reached Henry VIII, the king didn't call his judges, he didn't summon his legal scholars, he didn't wait, he acted, swiftly, furiously. He created a new law, not with counsel, but command. The 1531 Act of Parliament decreed, poisoning would no longer be simple murder, it would be high treason, a crime once reserved for kingslayers, plotters, and traitors to the crown. And the punishment? Not rope, not axe, not fire, boiling, alive. This wasn't evolution. It was eruption, a legal detonation, crafted in terror, signed in haste, and meant to frighten more than to govern. Roose was the first victim of this law, but the real casualty was the legal tradition itself. For centuries, English justice took pride in its measured pace, trials by jury, rights of the accused, process over passion. But in one fevered moment, a pot of stew unraveled it all. The law became heat, justice became spectacle, and fear became binding. It didn't last. The statute was rarely used. Even those loyal to the throne felt the shame of it. But the damage had been done, because once a ruler crafts law not to serve, but to intimidate, the balance shatters. Law ceases to be blind. It glares. It chooses. It strikes not at the guilty, but at the inconvenient. Richard Roose didn't just die in a cauldron. He died at the boiling point of unchecked power. And though the pot was cooled and the statute dissolved, the echo lingered, a scar in the story of English justice. Because sometimes it's not a man who breaks the law. It's the law that breaks the man, and worse still, breaks itself.